Welcome to Slaying the Dragon for Putters. Now, in the introductory video we've seen that white, with his move f2, f4, which constitutes the Levenfish Attack, is setting up some very nasty threats against black's position. But, of course, now it is black's turn to move, and in this video I want to take a look at one of the most logical, intuitive defenses that black has. Hey, if you're a dragon player and you play g7, g6, you also want to put your bishop on that long diagonal, right? So, in this video I take a look at bishop g7. Okay, well now of course the main move is e5, and it kind of forces an immediate crisis on the board, and black has to make a very good decision here. Now, the best move here is knight h5. And even though a knight on the rim is dim, it is best for the fact that not exchanging an e5 keeps as many central files closed as possible. For instance, the d file will stay closed, the f file will also remain closed, so the h-rook from white will not be able to actively attack f7. And also, important, the development of the bishop on c1 is hindered, and it cannot go to g5 or h6 as in some other variations. So I think that this is the main reason why it is best to play knight h5. White is attacking you. He has a slight lead in development, so don't open up the position if you're playing with black here. Okay, now let's see how this main line could develop. White still wants to give this check. It was possible maybe here to play g4, some of you may think. You know, why not attack the knight on the edge of the board immediately, because it doesn't have any squares, right? Well, that's not completely true. It does have squares. It can simply take the pawn on f4, because after bishop takes f4 there is this fork with d takes e5, regaining one of white's pieces. So in this position it would probably be best to play bishop b5 in between, and then after bishop d7 e takes d6. But in this position, when white threatens to take the knight here on f4, black can retreat the knight to e6. And after knight takes e6 and f takes e6, I suppose the position is more or less equal. Let's not forget that even though this looks very nasty for black, this here also looks very nasty for white. And there's just no immediate attack here on black's position. So that is not the best way to go after knight h5, since after g4 black has the counter blow, knight takes f4. Now that's very important to note. So bishop b5 check immediately is the best. And now black can make a mistake with knight d7, for instance, because then we have the well-known trick e5 e6, attacking the pinned knight on d7. So f takes e6 is kind of forced, but after knight takes e6 this knight is dominating the board and attacking both bishop and queen here. And even though black can save one of these pieces by means of check, like this, bishop takes c3 check. After b takes c3, his queen is still attacked, and after queen a5, for instance, and queen d4, white has a very significant advantage. That just has to do with the fact that his pieces are more centralized. Note that now it is not possible for black to take this bishop, because it is indirectly defended by the move knight c7 check, winning black's queen. So after bishop b5 check, the best move here is bishop d7. But now it seems that black is able to hold the position. White can try several moves here, such as e6 for instance, but after bishop takes b5, And now the in-between check on f7, king takes f7, knight c takes b5, a6, chasing back the knight to c3 and knight c6. Well, it doesn't seem as though white has any kind of a dangerous attack here. He has to deal with the attack on his knight here in the center, so he doesn't really have time for moves such as f5. And black will probably move his knight back to f6 in the near future, and also his queen to b6 or a5, and then he also already has his back rank connected. So, that is not a very big deal for black if you play e5, e6 in this line. Also an interesting idea could be to play queen f3. I encourage you to have a further look at this, because this is some kind of pawn sacrifice where white is really playing for the lead in development here. But after d takes e5, attacking the knight, which means that queen takes b7 is untimely, because after e takes d4, white does win the rook in the corner, but black gains another piece on c3. It is probably best to play here f takes e5. But now, again, after bishop takes e5, black is threatening to take on d5, and then on c3 with check, removing the defender of the bishop on b5. So again, queen b7 would not be a very good idea. So white has to defend here with bishop e3. And after knight c6, black has had the worst. I suppose the position is kind of equal, but white is a pawn down. He may have better development and some pressure over the open files, but I feel that black can defend this position. So my recommendation for you after bishop d7 is just to play e takes d6 here, which is also one of the ideas of the thrust of white's e-pawn. Now it does take some time for white's e-pawn to rake down the board like this. I mean, you play e2, e4, then you play e4, e5, and then sometimes e5, e6, or as in this case, e5 takes d6. So if you invest this time, you should get something in return. And in this case, it would be the isolated d-pawn for black. And let's not forget that black's knight is still sitting on h5, so it would lose him some time to retreat it to f6, which means that, to my feeling, white is still in the driver's seat here. Now, black can react in certain ways here. Yeah, probably the most logical would be just to recapture the pawn. Then after this series of moves, when black recaptures on d7 because he wants to put his knight on c6, where it is much more active, attacking the knight on d4, white would continue with bishop e3, bishop c6, and now after queen d2, castles and castles, queenside, he may enjoy a slight advantage, even though black has quite a solid position after d6, d5. Of course, white can try and play against the isolated d-pawn here, but black is also not without chances. Of course, white is very firmly blockading the d4 square, but his bishop is a little bit unhappy, maybe that this pawn is sitting here on f4. So I think white would have to play for a combination of pressure against d5 and maybe also of the thrusts g4 and f5 where possible. But of course, now let's take away some of these colors. Black would reroute his knight from f6 to e4, and also he has some play against white's queenside castled position. And normally it's a little bit easier to attack a queenside castled position than a kingside castled position. And black also has the open c file as an attacking base for his pieces. Okay, so this is an exciting position, and I suppose white may have a small edge, but this is something really for you to try and study, how to play this position. Okay, but after e takes d6, black can also go in another way, which may prove to be very solid also. For instance, the immediate knight c6, not recapturing on d6, but counter-attacking the knight in the center. Now, d takes e7 would be not so recommendable, because queen takes e7 checks, and now, since there is still an attack on the knight on d4, that knight had better retreat to e2. But after castle's queenside, all of a sudden it is black who is very active and has loads of pressure down the central files. We can see that all his pieces are developed, and that of course there is an indirect threat to white's queen here, and also an indirect threat to white's king. Furthermore, this guy is blocking the bishop. This knight is pinned, of course. This bishop is sitting here quite nicely, but it is no longer attacking or pinning something. And yeah, in this case I would prefer to play with black, because white somehow needs to untangle his position. So after knight c6, white is best advised to play bishop e3 here. Just continue his development. And even though the bishop's diagonal may not be great in this direction, it is quite good in this direction, in both defensive and attacking points of view. From both attacking and defensive points of view. Okay, well, okay. Then, since there is no longer a queen e7 check, black can recapture here on d6. And now, after castles and castles, again, I think white may have a slight edge, but this is, I suppose, a position where black can defend himself and where both sides have their chances. Okay, white can still play for the idea of f4, f5, I suppose, and maybe try to play against this guy here also. But black has some pressure against these black squares here also. White has weakened himself a little bit by playing the aggressive f2, f4. Okay, well, this is my explication of the main line bishop g6, bishop g7 defense, when white, black plays knight h5. But what happens if after e4, e5, black decides to go d takes e5? And this is also a move that presents itself rather easily, because you put your pawn on d6 to safeguard the e5 square. So when a white pawn arrives there to chase away your knight, don't you just want to take away that pawn? d6 takes e5. And this is also a move that is, of course, quite regularly played, even though it's inferior to knight h5. But now it is very useful for you as a white player, for instance, to know how to continue and how you can gain a significant advantage. Only because of the fact that after d takes e5, the bishop's diagonal and the d file and the f file will be opened up much more than after knight h5. Sorry. Of course, white now continues f takes e5, and black is faced with a difficult decision here. His knight is attacked, and where should it go? Well, let's look at some obvious tries. I suppose that knight h5 could be answered with g4. And this time there is no knight takes f4. So this would be good for white, right? So yeah, exchanging the pawns on e5 also removes the f pawn to the e5 square. So there is no f pawn on f4 to be taken anymore. Okay, so knight h5 is not recommendable. Well, then what else after f takes e5? Well, let's have a look at knight g8. This does attack the e5 pawn, but after bishop takes f4, hey, this square has become available for the bishop. Very nice. It is obvious that white has a very significant lead in development, and with it a very significant advantage. So this is also not recommendable. Well then, what else? F takes e5. Let's look at knight d5 then. But the problem here is that the knight on d5 is not sitting there very stably. White plays bishop b5 check. And now we can see that bishop d7 fails to knight d5. We can simply take this knight. And knight d7 is also wrong for the same reason, also knight takes d5. So, knight c6 then? Well, you have the logical knight takes c6 winning material. So after bishop b5 check, all that remains really is king f8. But then of course, just a simple castles. And we can easily see that with the threat of queen f3 coming up, posing serious threats to this knight on d5 and the pawn on f7, white again has a very significant advantage, if not winning immediately already. And this has to do, of course, with black's king sitting there vulnerably on f8, and also white's black's rook on h8 is not participating in the game. So knight d5 is also really not recommendable. Well, then what remains? Knight g4 looks like a very natural square, isn't it? And actually it is of course one of the best tries. Now this move attacks the e-pawn 2 times. But for the moment white doesn't care, and he goes bishop b5 check. Now really the best move here is knight c6, because bishop d7 leads to the well-known queen takes g4. And knight d7, hey, queen g4. And also, very interestingly, king f8 is a serious blunder here, because maybe you can spot the move. I will count to 5, and please pause the video if you like. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Because of the surprising knight e6 check. And this is unleashing a discovered attack, not only checking the king, but also attacking black's queen here. And black is immediately lost, of course, so king f8 is also not good. So after knight g4 and bishop b5 check, black better play knight c6 here, renewing the threat to white's e-pawn on e5. Okay. But white can continue his attack here, of course, with knight takes c6. And he's saying, well, listen, I can just take this knight. If you recapture, I check you and I win at least the exchange in the corner, right? So, well, black player, do you think you're defending yourself or what? Well, in the case of b takes c6, yes, indeed. Then bishop c6 check, bishop d7, bishop takes rook, queen takes bishop, and castles. White has a very significant advantage. He's up material, and even though black's minor pieces are good and white's e-pawn is weak, and black also has the bishop pair and some strength on the white squares, really it is only white who is playing for the win here. So b takes c6 is indeed not advisable. But black can try something in between. He can now take white's queen. And it looks logical now to recapture with the knight on d1. But recapturing with the knight on d1, let me just execute that, would leave the knight on the edge of the board. It can no longer jump here or here and influence the board from the center. Also, it is blocking the d1 square for any white rook possibly coming to this d1 square. So my recommendation, even though it allows a counterattack, is to recapture with the king here. At least this keeps the knight on c3, and we will see that white does not need to fear knight f2 check. For the moment, he is also a piece up, right? Because he took a knight on c6. Let's not forget that. So after king d1, let's just see how black can defend and if he can regain the knight he lost on c6. For instance, now if we look at this knight f2, then we have king e2, already freeing up the d square, the d1 square, and of course now knight takes h1. But white now has the in-between, knight takes a7 check. And after bishop d7, he can further demolish black's position with e6, attacking the pinned bishop. So f takes c6 is probably best, and now after bishop takes d7 check, king d7 and bishop e3, protecting the knight on a7 and also attacking the knight in the corner. It becomes obvious that after this series of moves, white has a significant, if not winning, advantage. So, as it turns out, white does not need to fear the knight f2 check. So this means that after king d1, black is advised to play a6. Now this removes the pawn from a7, which was taken by the white knight in the previous variation, and also attacks this bishop on b5, which is of course posing the discovered check to black's king on e8. So then the game would continue bishop a4, just remaining on that diagonal, but of course black now has the added option of b5. And if he plays b5 now, then bishop b3 would be forced, and he again can try knight f2 check. But after king e2 and knight h1, bishop f4 is very strong, protecting the pawn on e5 and opening up the back rank to take black's knight. And after bishop g4 check, and king e3, rook c8 and bishop d5, it turns out that again white has the better of it. Now, can black improve a little bit? Yes, I suppose he can improve a little bit. But after bishop a5, where we just played b7, b5, he can also try to play the immediate knight f2 check. But then after king e2, knight takes h1, and bishop e3, bishop g4 check, king d2, bishop d7, and knight b4. Material is not bad for black, but he is staying behind. For instance, rook d8, knight d3, now regaining this pawn here on e5, but after bishop takes d7, rook takes d7, and rook takes h1, white still has a significant advantage. Okay, so if white emerges with the advantage in all these variations, then we can more or less safely say that after f takes e5, knight g4 is again not a very happy choice. But then again, is there a happy choice after e5 and d takes e5 and f takes e5? I already explained that the exchange on e5 severely enhances white chances in this Levenfish attack. Okay, well, we haven't looked at another main defense to f takes e5, and that is of course knight f d7. Now, at least on d7, the white, the knight cannot be taken. As we saw earlier, on d5 it could be taken with knight c3 takes d5. On g4 it was vulnerable to the attack from the queen on d1. At least on d7 that is not the case, and also black is already blocking in advance any bishop check on b5. But now white tries something else. He goes e6, attacking this knight and also the weak point on f7. Now again, black is faced with some nasty choices. What about knight b6? Well, then bishop b5 again would lead to a very significant, if not winning, advantage for white. Okay. Knight c5, for the same reason, would be not advisable. Bishop b5 check. So, well, what about f takes e6 then? Just keeping that knight on d7 and accepting the weakness of the pawn structure. Well, then that would allow this knight to come to e6, and we know that normally when this knight comes to e6, it's bad news for black. Again, white is attacking both queen and bishop, and black can save one of these pieces with check. Bishop takes c3, but after bishop c3 again the queen is attacked. And now the queen could go to b6, but that would be wrong, because on a5, as we will see later, it is more active, attacking the c3 weakness. On b6 it is attacking the knight on e6, but white simply defends that, and now is threatening knight g7. And if the king would move to d8, then we will see some kind of mating attack. I will point that out to you soon. And if the king would move to f8, then of course white's rook from h1 could join the fray over the opened f file. So knight c6, for instance, allowing the threat to be executed, knight g7 check. And now here, after king d8, we see the beautiful bishop f7, which is simply threatening mate by means of knight e6 check. Because the bishop is taking away the flee square, or the escape square would be more proper English, on e8. So, black better run, king c7, but then knight e6 again is very nasty, and the only square here is b8, but then bishop f4, check develops with tempo, and now black has to interpose one of his knights, which is now pinned, and after rook b1, yeah, black is on the verge of collapsing here, and he might as well resign. Well, he could try queen a5, but after knight d4, attacking the knight on c6, which is no longer protected by the knight on e5, because the knight on e5 is pinned. Black can try queen takes c3 check, but king f1, and black has just too many threats to face. For instance, queen takes d4 would be wrong because of queen takes d4, of course, here. So, f takes e6, knight takes e6, bishop c3 check, b takes c3, and queen b6 would be too slow. So, black is advised to play queen a5 here, counter-attacking c3. And this, this keeps the disadvantage within a certain limit here. White continues now with bishop f4. This is a multi-purpose move. It counter-attacks c7, so it supports the knight jump to c7. The bishop is also protected there by the knight on e6, and of course the rook on a1 and the queen on d1 are now protecting each other, which is very useful if this queen comes on c3 and checks, which it does right now. But white continues, king f2, and again black is forced with a difficult decision. Knight c7 check is threatened, and what to do? For instance, if you try king f7 to sidestep the check, then queen d5 would be very strong, threatening decisive discovered a check, or double check even. So that's not the way to go. And knight a6, protecting the c7 square, is also not good, because white would take out the defender of the c7 square. Bishop takes a6, b takes a6, and then simply again knight c7 check. Okay, so what remains is that black should look for some kind of a counter-attack after king f2, and that he can do with knight c6. I've told you before, and I will continue to do so on numerous occasions, there are several kinds of defense you can play, sorts of defenses you can play in check. You can take out the attacker, you can try and interpose something, you can move the attacked piece out of the way, you can try and protect it, you can try and do some kind of indirect attack, or you can try the counter attack, which is based on the boomerang philosophy. like, well, just execute your threat, because if you do, I will counterattack you, and maybe executing your threat will be boomerang for you. And indeed, in this position, that is the case. If now white would be very materialistic and play knight c7, king d8 and knight takes a8, he would be on the wrong side of the board after rook f8. Now this attacks the bishop on f4, and the bishop cannot move because it is pinned, and white can try and protect it with g3, but then after e5 it becomes clear that it is lost. And also the knight on a8 is sitting there in the corner, and it also can't join the game that easily, so probably in the long run that one is lost also. And then white's king is more vulnerable than black's, and black may even enjoy a material advantage. So in this case, after knight c6, white can try to play knight c7 check, but only for the reason to steal away black's right to castle, and maybe just to win some time on the clock. King d8, knight e6 check, and now again after the forced king e8, he should try something else. And this queen on c3 is sitting there very menacingly, so it makes sense to try and exchange that queen. Well, black has nothing better here than to exchange it, and now after rook e1, the threat again is bishop c7, because after a subsequent rook f8, white's king could go to g3, which was not possible with black's queen sitting here on the third rank. So in this position, after rook takes e1, again white maintains the advantage. Even though he's a pawn down, he does have the bishop pair. He has a superb knight on e6. There are still threats to these black squares, and black is certainly not out of the woods yet. So I think this is also a critical position that you may want to investigate further for your practical play. Okay, well, I think, let me check, that ends our discussion of the Levenfish with bishop g7, which is of course the most intuitive and the most logical defense. We have seen, to summarize a little bit, that after e5 it is best to go knight h5, because this does not open up files and diagonals for the white pieces. We've also seen that after d takes e5, which could be considered some kind of a mistake, f takes e5, black has a difficult time finding a good square for his knight. Probably the best was knight fd7, and then we had this kind of main line. Okay, no, excuse me, yes, I think I forgot to point out the most important defense to you, because in this position I showed you f takes e6, but there is probably an even better defense, and that would really end the video properly. Knight e5 is the best way to go here. I forgot to point that out to you, excuse me. Knight e5 still keeps an eye on the c6 square, which is an important blockading square for the bishop check to come. Now in this position, white damages black's pawn structure, but after king takes f7, note that knight f7 is not good because of the bishop b5 check square. After king takes f7, white continues to develop with bishop e2, preparing a check on f1, and also defending against any black piece, maybe coming to g4. And after knight b6, castles check and bishop f5. Again, white emerges with the advantage here. It's not a material advantage, but it's a very significant positional advantage. Now, the in-between queen d1 would be a gross blunder because of knight takes e5 check in between, and white remains up a piece. or 2 pieces at least. So after knight takes c6, b takes c6 is forced. But then we can see that after bishop e3, black has 4 pawn islands to white's 2, and white's king is also safer. The bishop on f6 is pinned. Any exchange of queens will lead to a better endgame for white. So this is a difficult position for black, I would think. Okay, having said that, we really have come to the end of the discussion of Levenfish with bishop g7. Okay, I hope this video has been instructive for you. I've tried to point out some major issues in fighting the dragon in this way, and also how to defend against this Levenfish with f4 if you opt for bishop g7. Okay, in other videos we will look at some other 6th move alternatives for black, some of which are dubious and some of which are playable. Okay, thanks for watching, bye bye.